within our office, the way things work is that when a business comes to us, when a union comes to us, when someone in one of our regional shops or our functional shops speaks to a lawyer like Catherine or anyone else in our office and says, look, we've been working at this for months, if not years, and we seem to have run into a dead end. This seems to us to have a legal dimension to it. When that happens, we then think about it. We see what's on our plate, what our resources are, what the dimensions of the dispute are, what's the legal issue potentially involved, what's the amount of trade that's involved. And we put those things together and prioritize at a given moment what kind of priority to give, whether to move ahead with that kind of a matter. Then as a second stage, we investigate. If it looks like it's an important enough case in any of those particular dimensions, then we investigate a little bit further to see if, in fact, it does appear that we have legal rights and that we could be successful in a dispute settlement context. And if that's the case, then we review all the same criteria yet again. What's the size of the trade? What's its impact on future actions this government may take? If we think that a government may have different factions, as governments do, and some of them have been advocating an action in this particular way, and we think that if we simply sit back and not take action with respect to it, they'll do that again and again. By contrast, if we indicate that we're aware that it's inconsistent with WTO obligations or an FTA obligation, it might send a signal to other factions within that government. It might send a signal to other governments who are watching about their own behavior. Then we begin to see the value of investing 1 or 2 or 3 attorneys' time over a period of years to try to bring a matter to resolution. And my answer to this question, I think, also illustrates to all of you how important it is to my office as well as to the USTR and to the administration to resolve these matters without having to go to litigation. We will do whatever we need to when dispute settlement is required. However, it's a lot better for a business and certainly better for the resources in our office if we're able to resolve these matters in a context that is much speedier and less resource intensive.
So I'm going to make today 3 points. First, I applaud President Obama's enforcement initiative. Enforcement is a core component of U.S. trade policy. But it's also important not to lose sight of a basic reality that the number of WTO cases has continued to decline and that this trend is likely to continue. The trend has nothing to do with who is president, but reflects some broader forces that are at work in the WTO system. And finally, while active, aggressive enforcement is important, we shouldn't kid ourselves that enforcement per se constitutes a trade policy or that by itself it can achieve President Obama's goal of doubling U.S. exports in 4 years. So at most, enforcement is one component of a larger policy that addresses the value of the dollar, restores bipartisan support for trade, addresses distorted currencies, boosts U.S. competitiveness, and reforms our educational and tax systems. And I applaud these elements of President Obama's speech last week, but the reality is that they are much, much harder. So from a Republican standpoint, at this point, I'd give President Obama's enforcement initiative an A+ for delivery, a B for content, and a final grade, incomplete.
One of the problems with enforcement is that the rules aren't as good as one would have them. If someone comes in with a problem to USTR, and I'm sure that one of the aspects that they look at USTR is, okay, what is exactly the slam dunk case we're about to bring to Geneva and get a panel to vote in our favor? And if you look at the standards code or subsidies code or trims or our old problem of border tax adjustments where we can't rebate our direct taxes and others can rebate a large part of their tax system because they rely on value-added taxes, and areas that are gray-ish like procurement, the use of stimulus funds, domestic enforcement of trips, what is legal, and under negotiation in Doha, the large tariffs that can be imposed by the Brazils and Indias of this world because their bound tariffs are very high. You find out there's a lot that isn't covered. And that's why something, I'd say an improved and reformatted Doha round, but some multilateral negotiation is needed because dispute settlement isn't going to solve all of our problems. And there may be more non-violation cases coming along where we didn't get what we bargained for as opposed to a specific rule is violated. Sort of lastly, there has to be some restraint in bringing cases, and some things are better solved by negotiation.
First of all, we need to remember that trade enforcement is a two-way street. If we want other countries to uphold their obligations to us, then we must be willing to uphold our obligations to them. We may or may not agree with any particular decision in dispute settlement. Be that as it may, it's in our interest to comply with rulings in dispute settlement within a reasonable period of time and to move on. That way, we'll have the credibility to be aggressive in enforcement where our rights are not being respected, and that way the system will have the credibility that we want it to have to uphold our rights. I would also say in conclusion that I agree very strongly that dispute settlement should almost always be the last resort. A great success of the system is the way in which the mere existence of a binding system encourages countries to comply with their obligations and, furthermore, encourages the resolution of disputes. Countries really don't want to lose before the whole world, so they also want to comply with their obligations if they're reasonably certain of what they are. I will point out as a technical matter that in the current dispute settlement understanding, there are alternatives to the process that is almost always used. There is the opportunity for mediation and for conciliation, and in some limited cases it has been pursued. My own view is that it should be pursued more often.
The one thing that distinguishes rich countries as complainants from poor countries as complainants under the WTO is rates of early settlement. It is the only dimension on which rich do better than poor. Early settlement is where the action is in this institution, and it should be harnessed as the most efficacious portion of the system. And on this front, as far as DSU reform is concerned, the worst thing in the world would be to do anything that increases the transparency of consultations. Don't touch it.